Hey guys, Chris Fix here, and today I'm going to show you how to replace an alternator. This is a really simple job that you could do yourself in most cases. There's no special tools, and to figure out how easy the job's going to be, all you have to do is locate your alternator. In my truck, you can see the alternator is right at the top, which makes it really easy to get to. If your alternator is near the top of the engine, the job is going to be simple. If the alternator is buried, it could be more difficult. If you're not sure if your alternator is bad, I have a video that shows you how to test an alternator, so check that out. It's really simple and you could do it yourself. A link to that video will be in the description. Here's where my alternator is having a problem. When the engine goes above 4,000 RPMs, the battery light comes on, and the voltmeter that's built into my truck, it just drops. There should be 14.2 volts. Well, I'm not even getting that. I'm getting like 10 volts, 9 volts, once the RPMs go above 4,000 RPMs. So not only is the alternator shot, but I'm running a large light bar up top, some lights in the rear, as well as off-road lights in the front. So I want a larger alternator to keep up with my electrical demand. The stock alternator is 95 amps, and the new alternator is 130 amps. And if you're curious to where I got this alternator, I'll go put a link in the description below. As always, they have pretty good prices, and they got it to me really quickly. So let's go get started in changing this out. Here are all the tools you're going to need to do the job. We have a ratchet, extension, and different size sockets. Metal wire brush, flathead screwdriver, anti-seize, and then we have a torque wrench, breaker bar, and the only specialty tool that you don't really need but I have is this serpentine belt tool. It helps get the serpentine belt off. You could always just use your breaker bar or a long wrench. So let's begin. Anytime you work on the electrical system, the first thing you want to do, especially when changing out the alternator, take off the negative terminal on your battery. Make sure it's not getting grounded out. Now you're good to work on the alternator. The next step is you need to access your alternator. So try to make your life easier and make as much room as possible. We really don't want to take off this coolant hose because then you get coolant everywhere, but what we can do is take off this intake hose, which is really easy to do. To get the intake hose off, there is a hose clamp right over here. Use a flathead screwdriver. Now we're just going to disconnect this hose that's over here. I'm going to just wiggle this off. Good. We can come over here to our mass airflow sensor. Disconnect the little mass airflow sensor electrical clip. Now we can just take this off, just like that. Always remove your filter so you don't damage it. And look at that, we have easy access right here. Now let's go take the belt off. To remove the belt, they do make a special tool that helps remove belts. I'll put a link in the description to where you can get it. You don't need to use this, it's just like a long ratchet. If you have a breaker bar that's kind of narrow and skinny, you could use that. Or if you have a long wrench, in this case this is 15 millimeter. And what you're going to do is you're going to go down into the pulleys and look for the tensioner pulley. So you can see right down in here, we go over here, the tensioner pulley is the spring-loaded pulley right there, and that's how you relieve the belt tension. So you just go down in here, get the tool on the end of the bolt of the tensioner, then you just take it and you pull the ratchet, the tool, whatever you have, towards you, and that pushes the pulley against the tensioner spring. So you relieve the pressure, and you can see now the belt is nice and loose. And since we're only taking off the alternator, it makes your life a lot easier. Just take off the belt on the alternator, and I'll leave the belt tucked in here so it doesn't come apart and unwrap from around these pulleys. Just in case if it does, you can see right here, it's got the diagram of how the belt's routed around the pulleys. Now let's go take the alternator off. Taking the alternator off is really easy. You can check your brand new alternator to see how many bolts it has. You can see 1, 2, and then 1 at the bottom is 3. So we're going to be looking for 3 bolts to take off. Looking at this alternator, there's 1, there's 2, there's 3. So we're good to go. Before we do that, you want to check the back of the alternator, see what connections you have here. You can see that there's 3 connections. Got this little one here, got a larger clip right here, and we have the positive cable coming out here. I usually like to get these off before I remove the alternator, especially since there's plenty of room to get to them back here. So let's go do that. So the first cable we're going to take off is the red battery cable. This is the power from the alternator to the battery. Runs all the way up over to the battery. It's a 10 millimeter. Slide your socket over that. Good. Although our negative terminal is technically disconnected, just cover this up so it doesn't ground out. Better to be safe than sorry. You could even get some black electrical tape if you want, but that's good enough. Okay, now we're going to remove this connector and this connector. Flathead screwdriver might help. That's one. And that's two. Now we can remove this wiring harness and move it off to the side. Removing the actual alternator is really easy. We'll start off with this front bolt here. There's 3 bolts total. I'm going to use a breaker bar because these bolts are kind of tough on here. It's the original alternator. Car's 2001, so it's pretty old. Good, broke that free. We'll do the bolt that's up here. Broke that free. And then there's one more bolt right back here. Okay, all 3 bolts are broken free. Now we can loosen them up all the way. That's 1. That's 2. And 3. Now we can pull out the old one. Now with the alternator out, we have this alternator bracket here. And you just want to get a piece of sandpaper, or in this case I have a metal wire brush. And you just want to clean up the connection where the alternator actually sits on here, because the alternator is grounded to the block through this bracket. So the better the connection to the alternator, the better your electrical system will perform. You also want to grab the bolts and clean off the bolts. You can see here there's all this white corrosion on the threads here. You want to have a good connection, so it's good to clean this off. And that cleaned up very nicely, so we're going to get an even better connection now. So with all the bolts cleaned up, and with the connections here all cleaned up, let's go put the new alternator on. As always, when I'm installing 2 new parts, I like to put them side by side, make sure that they look right. You can see this alternator is definitely bigger, but the bracket mounting spots are the same, and the alternator pulley itself is the same size. So it looks like we are good to go. And just for anybody who's doing this project on a Ford pickup truck or Ford SUV or the Mazda pickup truck, Mazda SUV, the 4-hole pattern here indicates the 95 amp alternator, and the 2-hole pattern here indicates the 130 amp alternator. Just something good to know, especially if you're looking for parts in the junkyard. You're trying to find this alternator in the junkyard or something. You know that's the 130, and then this is the 95. Now we're going to get our new alternator, put it in place. One thing you might consider on these bolts is anti-seize. Just put a little bit on. And using just a little bit of anti-seize like that on the threads will just make it that much easier to get off if you ever need to replace this in the future. Now we'll get our top bolt in. You just want to get it started. Now we're going to get the next 2 in. The reason why you just want to get it started is because you want to be able to move this alternator around to make sure you get the next bolt in its position. And then this last one should slide right in. Just like so. Now with all 3 bolts hand tightened and threaded in, we could start tightening them down. You don't want to tighten them down all the way, just get them snug, and then we'll torque them down. So now that all these are snug, we're going to get our torque wrench and set it between 30 and 40 foot-pounds. I'm doing 38 foot-pounds. 1, 2, 3. Now all we have to do is connect these wires, connect our intake here, and we're ready to go for a test ride. Plug that in, plug that in. Make sure you have a good connection in here. You can use your metal wire brush just to make sure it's clean, or some sandpaper, whatever you got. Take the nut off, slip the power cable over the stud, and hand tighten. Good. You want to make sure that you slide this protective boot over that. Just seals out any water and also prevents any unintentional grounding or arcing. Good. So we got our top connector connected, that middle one connected, and our power line connected. Make sure that we have our plastic piece here over the alternator. It's just a heat shield. It protects the alternator from the excess heat. Now we're just going to get the belt on the alternator. And you can see it doesn't fit until we pull this. Good. The belt is on here correctly. It's on the rest of the pulleys correctly. Then we can take off our belt tool. Just inspect to make sure that the belt is on all the pulleys correctly. It's in the middle. It's not on the edge because the belt was a little loose. Looks good. See, it fits right on perfect. Everything looks good. It's on the tensioner. Now let's put on the air intake and let's go for a ride. Drop our filter back in place. This clicks in, just like so. Now you want to make sure that this hose goes all the way around your intake. Just like so, there's no gap here. Then we can get our flathead screwdriver, tighten this down. Good. Remember to connect our PCV hose here. Good. Make sure you plug in the mass airflow sensor. One last thing to do, connect our negative terminal. And let's go for a ride. Alright, let's start her up and see what we got. So we've been driving around for a few minutes. I'm going to slow down here and give it gas to drop a gear and hit over 4,000 RPMs. Beautiful. Everything is working perfectly, and that is a job well done. And that's how you properly replace an alternator. Hopefully this video was helpful. If it was, remember to give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button. Up on the screen are going to be a bunch of videos. To get to those videos, you could click on the screen or follow the links in the description.